Welcome. We'll be getting going on the webinar in about 11:05 to allow, at least Central Time, to allow folks to get all the way in. We had a lot of registrants, so excited to see everybody coming in today. We'll be talking about food as a human right, so we'll get going in a couple of minutes. Also in the chat, if folks need Spanish translation, our translator Letty has put in the instructions for turning on kind of simultaneous Spanish language translation supports. And yes, thank you, Ebenezer, for putting in your info. Welcome from Liberia. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be getting going in a couple of minutes. And if people do want to highlight that they're here and where they're calling in from, that'd be great. Excited to know the width and breadth of who all is here today. So if you could put your name, organization, if you're affiliated, and where you're located, would be great. Great. Thank you for putting in your info. Starting to see folks from all over the US. Thank you. Some familiar names and some new folks. Great. Yeah, thank you. Keep putting in the names. Um, okay. Vancouver, excellent. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Um, I'm Roger Cooley. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. The honor and privilege of moderating today's webinar, which is mostly going to be handing it off to our esteemed panelists. But we'll jump into a couple of other housekeeping things, and then we'll go into introductions and get started. Um, Again, and just it was just put in the chat, and it's been put in there a couple of times. Um, Translation explanations. So if you go down to your bottom of your screen and you're looking for Spanish language simultaneous translation, again, the instructions are on the right, but there's a globe that you can click on that'll let you move into the different translation settings. Also, as we're going throughout the presentation, we will not be answering questions simultaneously, but we'll be reserving that for the end, starting about 12:35. So about halfway through the session, we'll move in the Q&A. Please put in any questions you have into the Q&A button on the bottom, and we'll be organizing and trying to synthesize common ones. But please, as we go through, and if you have specific questions for speakers, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. This webinar is kind of an early stage explanation. We're assuming there may be some folks here, just seeing some of the chat, who have a lot more experience and expertise with using and leveraging food as a human right for policy change at subnational levels, meaning state and local. But we'll be doing kind of a high level introduction to food as a human right, or adequate food as a human right, with Marie Lara with FAO, and I'll get in the introductions in a moment. And then we'll be moving to Allison with the National Right to Food Community of Practice, and Allison will be talking about how taking the international frameworks and adapting them and adopting them and leveraging them at local contexts across the US, And then Nessa from Rhode Island will give a quick um, case study in what they've been attempting to do and working on this fall for adapting and using food as a human right within their policy context. And then after, we will be sending out follow-up. We're calling aftercare. So resources, the presentation, links to other opportunities and events and other ongoing documentation resources will be coming out after this as well. But we'll get into the introductions. So I want to start with Rilara. She is a right to food specialist for the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and a Canadian lawyer specializing in human rights. She serves as the FAO Right to Food team's focal point for North America and for relations with parliamentarians worldwide. She also leads their efforts on people and the planet and on business connections between business and human rights. Then we'll have Allison, who's the co-founder and director of the National Right to Food Community of Practice, a growing networks of folks across the country focused on shared learning and capacity building among those advocating for right to food as a local, state, or regional levels. Allison has 30 years experience supporting grassroots-led organizations addressing root causes of hunger and poverty at the intersection of food, insecurity, agriculture, racism, health, human rights, and climate change. Allison at heart is a Southerner. I guess so am I. Um, from the mountains of North Carolina, but has been living, biking, gardening with her family in Brooklyn, New York for 2 decades. I've had the honor of working with her for many of those 2 decades. Um, and then Nessa Richmond is the executive director of the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, an independent statewide network with a mission to create a more just and resilient food system in the Ocean State. Nessa serves as the Rhode Island lead for the New England State Food Systems Partnership, New England State Food System Planners Partnership, a 6-state collaboration aiming to achieve 30% regional food consumption by regional production by 2030. Nessa is also the two-time recipient of the Juneau Women's Leadership Residency and author of the forthcoming Food Policy Council's Building Civic Engagement Community Well-Building book coming out in 2026. And Nessa and I came up with the idea for this after we've been engaging in food policy conversations and also had the good fortune to be able to travel to Rome for a Food Policy Council conference there and meet with folks at UN and FAO and be engaged with the conversation and how they're looking at adopting right to food for local communities, again, at the subnational level, and not just, and particularly in the US context, we've not had a hospitable policy context at the federal level for right to food, but recognizing that there are many or hundreds of food policy councils and similar organizations and coalitions across the country who are moving in this direction and seeing the power and potential for right to food, and also recognizing that the context we're operating in the US currently has not been a hospital environment for um, food efforts and the protections of food as a human right, particularly recognizing the cuts and slashes, the SNAP, the constant politicization of food access, and really seeing is this a potential framework for holding a lot of work we've all been focused on over the years. But I'll turn it over to Marie Lara and get going with her presentation. Thank you all.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Roger. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. So in the few minutes that we have together, we'll introduce the Right to Food framework, and you'll see that the right to food is not only a human right and it holds legal obligation under international law, but realizing the right to food is also a process that is anchored in the human rights-based approach. So the right to food sheds light on the structural causes and the systemic factors of exploitation of both people and resources. And it calls for us to acknowledge existing power imbalances, and this includes, of course, at the local level. And so to preserve agri-food systems that are rooted in local cultures, in resources and knowledge, we must ensure the protection or reconstruction of the solidarity and respect that we have for one another and for nature. Next, please. So I propose to structure our time together in two parts. So we'll first introduce the right to food as a global framework that can guide us as a compass, helping us to strategize how to best transform our agri-food systems to make them resilient, equitable, and sustainable. And we'll briefly address states' obligations and the responsibilities of actors, including corporate actors. And then we'll discuss inclusive governance and meaningful participation, looking at concrete examples. Next, please. So let's start with the definition of the right to food. So the right to food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for its procurement. And we'll come back to this definition in a few time. And next, please. So there are two fundamental notions that lie at the heart of the right to food, the concept of dignity and the legal recognition of the right to food. And dignity is really essential for the right to food as it places people at the center of our discussions and processes. Next, please. So first, a very short differentiation between food security and the right to food. So food security is a condition. It's a state that one is in. It can change with time. So we're either food secure or food insecure according to well-defined criteria. The right to food is a fundamental human right. It does not change with time, and it applies to all of us, to you and to me. It belongs to everyone at all times. It includes both the right to be free from hunger and the right to adequate food. So it's not something that we do because it is fair or because we think it's the right thing to do. Next, please. We'll go very quickly through the history of the right to food just to anchor our discussion in the depth of what it means through time. So the United Nations and the FAO were born from the ashes of war 80 years ago, and they were both founded on the conviction that peace cannot be built where hunger prevails. Next, please. So the right to food has been part of international law for over 75 years. So since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and with Article 25, that states that everyone has the right to a standard of living that is adequate for their health or their well-being, including food. Next, please. The FAO was founded in 1945, but in 1965, its constitution was amended to formally embed hunger eradication as a primary mission of the organization. Next, please. And around the same time, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was adopted in 1966 with Article 11 that enshrines the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food, and establishes the fundamental right to be free from hunger. So it makes it clear that governments have an obligation to take steps to progressively realize the right to food, including through international cooperation, and to improve living conditions over time. Next, please. Then, with time, there's been the World Food Summits that reaffirm the right to food as the fundamental foundation of all strategies to achieve food security and combat malnutrition. Next, please. And general comment number 12 clarified and deepened our understanding of what the right to food truly means. And it remains with our Article 11 of the Covenant remains the most authoritative legal interpretation of the right to food to date. And it's one of the most detailed economic, social, and cultural rights. In the 2000, there's been the implementation of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, which is tasked to monitor the global situation of the right to food, promote its realization, and advise governments and institutions through concrete recommendation. Next, please. And there's been this global understanding and agreement by member states that the right to food needed to be further promoted and realized. And after a 2-year process of intense intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder negotiations, there's been the adoption of the right to food guidelines as a tool for states to implement concretely the right to food. We'll go quickly through the next slide. So next. Yeah, and next. So this is the advanced normative framework around the right to food. You see binding and non-binding international law. Next. Again, some instruments that look at different specific groups of actors. Next. And so the right to food, as we said, is divided into two components. So the right to be free from hunger, which is the minimum core of the right to food, and the right to adequate food, which is the right for every individual to feed themselves in dignity, to lead active and healthy lives. Next. So states have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food through concrete steps, and this includes a legal duty to protect actors against harm from third parties. Next, please. So the right to food has four main components. So food must be available. So this means that people must be able to feed themselves and their families, either directly through productive resources or in buying food. So we can think of the access to land and well-functioning markets. Next. Food must also be adequate. So it must be nutritionally sufficient, safe to consume, and culturally acceptable. Next. Food must be accessible through economic means or physically, so without any forms of discrimination. Next. And food must be sustainable, so we must access and have available food, not only for present generations, but also for future generations. Next, please. The right to food is also a process, as mentioned, so it must be implemented through the human rights-based approach. In FAO, we use the Panther principles simply because it creates easier to remember acronym. Next, please. We go very quickly, but of course, there would be so much to say on all of those human rights principles. Um, but very quickly on the responsibility of all actors. So rights holders is all of us, duty bearers are the government who hold the responsibilities, and then the other actors are including international UN institutions who must contribute to the realization of the right to food. Next, please. Again, please. And we'll end on a few concrete examples that reflect the importance of governance that are inclusive, multi-level, so that means that they involve all forms of government, that are multi-sectoral, so including, let's say, land, agriculture, health, and education, and also processes that are multi-actors, so including not only government actors, but also civil society and private actors. And so we keep in mind that the political structures can have real and profound impacts on the implementation of human rights, and that when responsibilities are fragmented across different levels of government, such as federal, state, and local level, it really requires strong coordination. And there's an increasing recognition of the decisive role that local food systems can play in promoting local economies, livelihoods, and health, as well as their resilience in times of crisis. But very often, the capacities and the resources of local authorities are not aligned with their responsibilities. So there's a need for capacities, including knowledge, but also budget. So quickly on the examples in Quebec, the city of Sherbrooke has become the first municipality to explicitly recognize the right to food, embedding it in a food charter. So Sherbrooke now aims to develop a democratic local food governance system and is considering establishing a local food policy. In Switzerland, amidst the COVID crisis, there's been fantastic organization by academicians, culinary chefs, and citizens that led to the organization of a 3-day forum on the right to food. This led to a Geneva Manifesto, which is a collective vision that then led to a referendum where 65% of voters supported to enshrine the right to food into their local constitution. And it's now done with Article 38A. And it also led to a parliamentary initiative with the Swiss federal constitution to discuss the inclusion of the right to food. In France, there's also a process with the with the National Assembly to create a right to food framework law. In Quebec, there's going to be a forum this coming April on the right to food, also discussing to have a framework law. And in Brazil, we present it as a fantastic example showing the multi-level and participatory governance structures, where the Conselho is an institutionalized national council which brings together civil society voices, which represent two-thirds of the representatives, and the other third is with government officials. I'll stop here and happy to respond to questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lara. That is a ton of information to have to digest in 10 minutes, but thank you for setting the table um, for kind of the 80 years of history and background that's gotten us to this place and the conversations internationally around what a right to food legal framework is and how it's evolved and adapted and keeps being more contextualized at the individual nation level. Thank you so much. Um, Real quick, for folks who came on a little later, if you please feel free to add your name and location and where you are um, in the chat just to get a sense of who's in the room. And then please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for going ahead and getting any questions as they come up that you would like to have answered at the end. But we'll go ahead and hand it over to Allison with the National Right to Food Community Practice.
Great. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here today at the invitation of Roger and Nessa. I'm one of the co-founders of the National Right to Food Community of Practice and currently its director. I'm super energized by your interest and curiosity about how the right to food is relevant in a country that is yet to ratify many human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that Mari Lara made reference to, where essentially the right to food, housing, and healthcare is defined. Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly provide an introduction to how our organization understands the right to food and why we believe it's an important tool and framework during a moment in history when our democracy is at risk and the progress we've made in food systems transformation is being eroded daily. And then I'll give a very brief case study from Maine. Next. So why the right to food? We believe it is time for a radical shift in how we address the most pressing intersectional problems of our time: chronic food insecurity and diet-related disease, climate change and industrial farming, the widening chasm between the uber-rich and the rest of the economic strata, persistent racism, and the corporate capture of our democracy. A human rights framework requires a holistic, multi-sectoral, and coordinated approach in action and advocacy, and we believe that requires intentional coordination across the various streams of food systems work throughout the U.S., while building stronger links to those advocating for economic justice and worker justice. There's a need for dedicated technical support, capacity building, and shared learning to support an advocacy approach that is both coordinated and multi-sectoral. And we believe there is the opportunity during this particular historical moment to lean into the power and possibility of local, city, and state policy solutions. Next. So what is our vision of a food system that protects and fulfills the right to food? We believe the purpose of our food system should be to nourish people and the planet by producing food, health, and well-being. That means working towards transforming our current food system into one that is rooted in equity and is just, one that produces food, health, and well-being for all of us, and one that moves us towards food sovereignty. Next. There are many paths to a just society, and I would argue that we largely know what works. During COVID-19, this is just one example, an enhanced social safety net, the closest we've ever come to a universal basic income, demonstrated that we know how to prevent people from falling into chronic poverty and food insecurity. We know which policies, practices, and public discourse, I'll argue, will create the equitable world we want to live in that puts people on the planet first. And yet we remain in a position where we're constantly plugging the holes to keep the dam from breaking. One reason for that is our advocacy efforts at a national scale tend to be siloed into sectors. We're farm and sustainable ag advocates seeking more appropriations and regulations to protect small farmers and fishers. We are climate and environmental advocates making the case for land conservation and renewable energy. We're food and nutrition advocates promoting stronger SNAP protections and universal school meals. Meanwhile, there are seismic shifts happening right now in our democratic institutions that suggest the dam is breaking in a way we've never experienced before. Next. A human rights framework requires a holistic, multi-sectoral, and coordinated approach, capturing food waste from big food and big ag and redistributing it through food banks, though a critical strategy in times of emergency and certainly at this moment when food insecurity is climbing, will not end chronic food and nutrition insecurity. And mega farms and big box grocery stores will never be the source of food production and access that supports the health of our bodies, minds, and the natural resources we depend on. It's time to challenge the framing of food as a commodity and resist the corporate capture of our food system. It's time to understand food and codify it in policy, practice, law, and discourse as a human right. Next. So what is the right to food? And I'm not going to I'm not going to uh, I'm not going to talk about what Mary Lara has already described so well and in such detail. But I just want to point out here that the U.S. is one of two countries that voted against the 2021 UN General Assembly's resolution on the right to food. The resolution reaffirmed the provisions of ISCAR in which the fundamental right of every person to be free from hunger is recognized. Next, and you can skip over this. Maria Lara has already talked to us about how the right to food can be read into many of the international human rights treaties. So we'll share that slide with you afterwards. So how do we, as the National Right to Food Community of Practice in the U.S., how do we understand the right to food? So let's first talk about the food part of the right to food. The right to food is about food in all the ways we know and experience food. It's about whether and how we can afford and access food that meets our needs without having to compromise on other basics like clothing, transport, or housing. It's about how available a variety of nourishing foods are, whether that's because we have the time and space and capacity to grow and produce food ourselves, or because we have a well-functioning values-based market system that makes sure those foods are available, or public institutions that ensure clients and staff have universal access to healthy food, or in times of crisis and emergency, a strong mutual aid or charitable source of food and meals. It's about how sustainable our food practices are, how farmers, fishers, and food producers steward our water, soils, and air as they grow, harvest, and distribute food around our communities. It's also about how well food nourishes us, whether it supports our health and well-being nutritionally, socially, and culturally. And for the right to food to be realized, all of these conditions would be present at the same time. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about the rights part. And there were many principles of human rights that that Mary Lara defined, and I'm just going to bring up three that we focus on. Human rights are universal, and while it may not seem like that in the way we encounter them in the real world, um, we need to remember that they are universal for everyone, no matter what. Legal protections just aren't strong enough in most places to ensure that people experience them as universal. Human rights are based on the inherent dignity of every human being. Human rights laws are imperfect, right? But they're designed to help us all work towards a world where we both recognize and create the conditions that support and enhance the dignity of every person. And human rights are about relationships between people and decision-making roles and all of the people who live in that city, state, or community. Including relationships as a fundamental characteristic of human rights is such an important part of each of us seeing ourselves in this work. We all have a role to play in realizing human rights, no matter what part of the food system you care most about or what level of influence you find yourself in. Next. Co-founded in 2021 by folks focusing on state-level food and farm advocacy, and shortly after Maine successfully amended their constitution to include food as a human right, the National Right to Food Community of Practice was formed. It's a national coalition of more than 280 advocates and organizations working to transform the food system by advancing the right to food in our cities, towns, and states. We believe that as we work towards realizing the right to food in communities across the U.S., this framework, the human rights framework, is an important tool for organizing. It's an important tool for narrative change and a tool for building power across sectors, as well as a tool for international solidarity and learning. It's a call to action for coordinated reform in food, agriculture, health, labor, and the environment. Next. While we accompany and support organizations that are advocating for state-level constitutional amendments, county ordinances that protect the right to food, and the inclusion of the right to food in city charters, we do not need to wait for a legal right to food to exist at the state or federal level before using a rights-based approach. With or without a legal right to food, we can work together to frame our actions, advocacy, and policy ideas through the lens of the right to food by promoting dignity and equity, respecting agency and self-determination, and embedding participation. Next. Our network is actively growing and building capacity among organizers and advocates in their organizations and communities, working at the state, city, or community level to develop tools for political education, narrative change, and advocacy strategies rooted in a right to food framework. A few of the things that we've done together and we're still working on is we developed a narrative framework for the right to food and an accompanying workshop series so people can begin to use them, our members can begin using the language in their communications and messaging. We've developed briefings and fact sheets for use in local and state advocacy. We've held in-person summits and monthly virtual convenings to share our experiences in practicing and progressively realizing the right to food. We supported communities in hosting people's tribunals on the right to food. We host a right to food learning and action fellows program, including mini grants. And we're developing a people's right to food organizing and implementation toolkit, including a policy assessment tool through the lens of the right to food. Next slide. I'm just going to wrap up here. We're currently accompanying several states, a couple of cities, and several counties in their efforts to codify the right to food law and policy. We're also supporting folks to advocate for state constitutional protections to strengthen the foundation of these commitments. So we're just going to really briefly look at Maine as an example. Passing with 60% of the vote in 2021, Maine is the only state in the country with the right to food embedded in its constitution. Many people, including some of you, have posed the question, what difference does a state-level constitutional amendment for the right to food make for those facing food insecurity or struggling to make ends meet as a sustainable farmer or fisher? How does it help protect the land and waterways from chemical contamination? And the truth is, we're still learning what difference it can make in real people's lives. At a minimum, what we're learning is that legal codification opens up possibilities for new policies and can be a tool for organizing and mobilizing people across multiple interests while holding elected officials accountable in times of crisis. Maine is currently faced with the difficult decisions of how to continue to fund food assistance and health care for Mainers after the U.S. Congress passed a budget after H.R. 1 that eroded both of these essential services. As a state, because they have ratified food, they've codified food as a right in their constitution, they're well positioned to take a rights-based approach to these challenges. Final slide. Next, our coalition is creating the building blocks for a broad-based social movement where grassroots power strengthens civil society and solutions emerge to transform unjust systems. We're not simply training or mobilizing advocates. Rather, we aim to win hearts and minds and fundamentally change the food system to one that produces food, health, and well-being while protecting the planet. And we invite you to join us.
Thank you so much, Allison, for bringing down the level of focus at the international level and starting to contextualize it in the US and recognizing you all have a community that folks who are looking to explore more about right to food is an opportunity for joining with you all for ongoing building relationships and cross-learning from other folks. And also want to highlight the Q&A box at the bottom before we move on to Nessa. So if you have any questions for speakers and about what they've been talking about, please put them in the Q&A box. I see something in the chat, but it's going to be easier for us to pull the questions together in the Q&A because there's so many great things coming in the chat right now, including other resources from Vancouver, for example. But want to hand it off to Nessa for kind of a overview or just a quick introduction to some of the things you've been thinking about and how to apply right to food in the Rhode Island context. So I hand it to you.
Thanks so much, Roger. Yeah, I'm just going to be providing a quick case study of how the Rhode Island Food Policy Council has been interacting with the right to food. So we are an independent statewide network that brings together diverse stakeholders to create a more just and resilient food system in Rhode Island. We've been around since 2011, but really only started learning about the Right to Food framework last June when, as Roger mentioned, he and I were able to go to Rome for the Food Policy Council workshop, but also visited the Food and Agriculture Organization there. At the meeting at the FAO, I learned that the policies that we're advocating for in Rhode Island fit into the Right to Food framework, and that using that framework has the potential to help us advance our advocacy efforts and help us build our relationships and stature at the State House. In particular, I learned that the right to food was relevant to a package of 4 bills being advanced by our Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos, which is called the Fair Price Grocery Agenda. And I'm not going to be going into the specifics of those 4 bills today, but I'm happy to share them with interested folks. And I'll put my email in the chat afterward. So once back in Rhode Island, I brought this information to the Rhode Island Food Policy Council staff and council members who were interested in learning more about it. And concurrently, the Right to Food staff at FAO decided to do a preliminary analysis of those 4 bills in the Lieutenant Governor's legislative package and produced a preliminary analysis of how they fit into the Right to Food framework and how they could be strengthened by integrating that framework more fully into bill language. So I met with the Lieutenant Governor's office at this time to relay this information and this interest and invited them to present about their legislative package and food access interests as well at our annual policy retreat. Shortly afterward, the Lieutenant Governor decided to join our annual policy retreat for the first time. And early this fall, we held that retreat, which has a goal of collaborative selection of policy priorities for the upcoming legislative session. So that event has lots of interactive presentations and discussions about food access and nutrition security, food business and economic development, and food climate and environment. And at the plenary of that event, I was able to introduce the Right to Food framework to participants, and then the Lieutenant Governor presented her priorities with that context fresh in everyone's minds. So after that event, the Council decided to join the U.S. Right to Food Community of Practice. And our first act was to use the Right to Food framing to call on our governor to act to protect food access for lower income Rhode Islanders through a sign-on letter. The letter called for the governor and state leaders to immediately allocate resources to our State Department of Labor and our Department of Human Services to ensure that residents would get the help they needed with increasingly difficult SNAP paperwork demands, to reconvene the General Assembly in a special fall legislative session to proactively address the impact of federal cuts and swiftly protect Rhode Islanders before the harm deepens, to prioritize increasing state revenues for basic needs that will otherwise be lost as a result of the federal cuts. For example, the letter noted by establishing a tax on top earners and using the resulting annual revenues to pay for emergency and supplemental food for Rhode Islanders in need. And finally, to affirm the right to food for all Rhode Islanders, to ensure and guarantee that all states' residents have regular, permanent, and unrestricted access to adequate food, and work to create the conditions that allow individuals to feed themselves adequately, safely, and in culturally acceptable ways. Over 50 Rhode Island organizations and businesses signed on to this letter, as well as a dozen faculty members from our state's colleges and universities. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well afterward. And the last thing I'll note is that we're currently working with the Lieutenant Governor's office to help integrate right to food framing and language into those 4 bills that make up their fair price grocery agenda before they're reintroduced in the coming session, which starts right after the new year here in Rhode Island. So we feel like that this subnational work to explicitly include right to food framing in state policy is particularly important at this time for the reasons that Allison mentioned earlier. We still at the Rhode Island Food Policy Council have a lot to learn about the framework and how to use it, and we're really looking forward to more learning, more network education, and more collaboration going forward. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that folks have about our case study, our example afterward.
Great, thank you, Nessa. So again, there is the Q&A box. If folks have questions, put in there. We'll be answering questions for about 15 minutes. Um, Marie Lara's jumped in and gotten a few answers in there, but we'll throw a couple of these out for the full group just to make sure we get some other thoughts. And also can talk through the answers that are in there now. But we'll start with this one. So what extent is the right, and this is an interesting, more of the kind of philosophical approach. To what extent is the right to food about ensuring everyone has access to adequate food as a human right versus being able to, and whether it is a versus or is an and, being able to participate in that process, i.e., growing their own food? And Laura, if you want to start with a brief answer, and we can hand it off to Allison as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the question. So the right to food, as presented, has those four normative components, no, of availability, adequacy, accessibility, and sustainability. And the core component of food availability is exactly this right for people to be able to feed themselves and their families. And this means that it can be done either through directly through productive resources, so through the land, through water, or in buying food in well-functioning markets. So the participation in the sense of growing our own food is part of the food availability component of the right to food. So it's part of international law. And just a quick word on the issue of meaningful participation in the processes of realizing the right to food, which is also part of the right to food framework. This means to have the possibility to meaningfully participate. So that means including all actors, including the most vulnerable, including the marginalized people, those whose lives are affected by the decisions that are made in agri-food systems transformation on their livelihoods. So including those people at all level of decision making, making sure that they have adequate information to make informed decision and to adequately contribute to those processes. I'll stop here.
Great, thank you.
So we wanted to be very explicit with our understanding and interpretation of the four elements and what we mean by the right to food. And so, in addition to talking about availability, sustainability, accessibility, and adequacy, we also have very clearly talked about a final characteristic, which is that communities must have self-determination and agency in defining their own local food and farm systems and economies that ensure the right to food. And that is derived very much in connection with La Via Campesina and other social movements internationally that are working towards food sovereignty. So it's an aspect that we've put right at the center of how we understand right to food framework and what we want to highlight.
So it's integrated rather than it's part of the complete approach and package of right to food rather than as a separate either or between having access and the ability to produce, which is always especially in the US context, is always part of the conversation is access being like, oh, it's being granted to you rather than being a meaningful participant within the food system.
Yeah,
Okay.
could I just add that
Yep.
I think that in the US context, we tend to equate right to food with food access, and I think that understanding the fullness and of the framework is an important aspect of being in solidarity with international efforts to codify and then progressively realize the right to food. And it is requires a critical shift in how we do our work here. It requires that we work across sectors. It requires that we understand poverty is the root cause of food insecurity in this country, and access to land is a critical piece of that, or access to waters for fishing. That these are part and parcel of what it means to guarantee and then progressively realize the right to food.
And certainly, I think one of the other big things that I'm continue to absorb and understand the centralness of process and self-determination you were just highlighting, Allison, is part of this work. And I think in the framework and space of food policy councils that we're, Ness and I are coming from, is seeing how we're part of that food democratization process, and thinking even more of this kind of holistic cycle, and that there needs to be this level of engagement and active, again, not thinking of access as something that's given to and passive, but there is this need to be for folks to have opportunities to be engaged as meaningful decision makers in these processes and having spaces for to build that power and to share that that those perspectives with those in power and be able to influence them. Okay, jump into the next one. So, and again, Laura added quite a few resources already, but what are some resources that you'd recommend for educating farmers and food producers about the right to food and its potential benefit and impact for them? Or even framings, introductions.
Would you like me to just
Yeah, we could.
maybe highlight that in the chat I've posted, and I think it will be also shared with all participants in follow-up emails after the event. So some links to the publication that we had 20 years after the adoption of the Right to Food guidelines. So this publication also includes many examples throughout the world that were shared to us on the realization of the Right to Food and the Right to Food guidelines. There's also an e-learning with 2 courses that are available. You can also look at the FAO website. There's a vast array of different tools and publications on different specific issues on the right to food. You can also always contact us, of course, and you can subscribe to a newsletter where we share some updates on concurrent and contemporary issues on the right to food that might be relevant to you, which includes discussions on native foods, local knowledge. As I see, it's also part of the comments and questions that come up.
I would add that just thinking about the multi-sectoral nature of guaranteeing human rights, that there's also just in I don't know, less than 10 years ago, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants was passed, was agreed to. And so that is, and by peasants, it's peasants and small farmers, I think, how they're calling it. So that is, I think, another really adjacent and important resource for small farmers as well. We're in the process, as the Right to Food Community of Practice, of developing a people's implementation toolkit for the right to food in the US. And so some of those tools will be available soon, and they will also include case studies. I think it's interesting to note that, and one of those will be a very detailed case study on what happened in Maine and how that's still evolving and what's come to pass. And it's interesting to note that it was small farmers that were at the helm of that advocacy effort. And it took about 10 years for the state to finally get it on the ballot, or for the citizens to push it to the ballot for a referendum. It took almost 10 years, and it was predominantly farmers, small farmers that were behind that effort.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move to we're not going to call it a speed round, but a little more concise round for answers. We have a few to get through. And of course, any question has a lot of complexity and nuance, but just kind of a kernel for folks to follow up on. So one is the potential and possibility for using once a right to food policy is passed in a state or locality, the potential for using legal challenges for following up and said, you've made this commitment, you've codified it. How do we make sure if your policies are not following through on that commitment? Is legal enforcement one of the options?
Yes, it definitely is. And um, that's not the ideal. The ideal is to codify it in policy. Once it's codified in law, once it's in the Constitution or in a charter, then the policy and appropriations that support that is the first ideal plan of action. But yes, legal recourse is possible.
Is there a US example of that yet, Allison?
There have been two cases. Well, it's only really because we have the right to food codified in Maine, but there have been two cases brought against the state, and because, as I understand it, an act to protect the right to food passed in Maine in this past year, that made the first case sort of non-existent. It took care of that, whatever the case was there. And there is another case recently, but I think it might also, maybe it's being resolved um, as well because of the provisions in this act. But I'm not sure. I need to get more details about that. But
Okay,
I'm happy to follow up.
great, thank you. All right. So we have a Native American producer who works at a food bank, and he has a couple of projects. One that focuses on the right to traditional foods and the right to cultural foods for marginalized urban communities. Um, and the question is what defines American cultural foods, but I guess that could be more broadly defined in a community, how, and within the right to food framework, how our cultural foods determined or articulated. So folks will know I have access to, I'm producing, I can harvest foods that are within my culture. And I'll ask Marla and Allison on this one.
I mean, I can comment that our understanding of the element of adequacy within the right to food framework is that food should be safe for consumption and acceptable within a given culture. So I think there's a clear link and understanding in the holistic right to food framework that food is culturally acceptable as a part of adequacy.
And that's self-determined by that community rather than an external group determining what's culturally appropriate for them. Okay. All right. And are there different approaches to rural communities versus urban communities in terms of the approach of how to, and I guess this could be taking approaches broadly, messaging, how to talk, yeah, again, how to talk about right to food in different communities, how to talk about or think about then what are the pathways for ensuring it, particularly thinking about different resources, cultures, dynamics.
Maybe one thing that I can inform participants too is a report that was published by the high-level panel of experts on the Committee on World Food Security. Their report was published, I think, in June 2024. And then this October 2025, at the Committee on World Food Security, member states agreed on recommendations that are specifically addressing urban and peri-urban agri-food systems. And the report and the recommendations clearly anchor what is needed in urban and peri-urban food systems on the right to food. So you'll have a detail of what that means in those specific contexts. I can put the link in the chat.
Great, thank you. Um, Here's one that I've not seen, but or interested in hearing the answer on this one. Have there been studies that has there been enough evidence, I guess, even to track food insecurity rates or other indicators between countries that have established a right to food framework and implemented it over a period of time versus kind of peer countries who haven't? Has there been any studies or tracking of what if there is a comparison point and if that's even measurable at this point?
That's a super interesting question, and it is as access to justice, no, as the question that came before on how the right to food is actually implemented or realized, and how it can go through a legal process. So there is a line of work from the FAO Right to Food team looking at access to justice and trying to look at which kind of cases, how the right to food was actually looked at by judges or by different actors, because it's not because the right to food is not specifically mentioned that it's not relevant to the structural dimensions that it entails. So that's something that will be, published. It has a U.S. component, so there will be details on the judiciability of the right to food available soon. And same with the monitoring of the right to food. So there's also a line of work looking at exactly that, the different index components, indicators that we can track and see. And it's very complex. No, in some regions of the world are more advanced in this work, like the Latin American Observatory on the right to food. And we're currently discussing exactly that, like how to monitor how the different actors and states are looking at the right to food, not only as an indicator of who adopted them in their constitution, because that doesn't give the granularity and the detail that is needed to know whether the right to food is actually realized and how. But super interesting line of work, and we hope to be able to share more soon on that.
Well, thank you all so much. We're getting very close to time and very appreciative of everyone's energy for participating today. So thank you so much, Marilara, Allison, and Nessa, for your engagement today and sharing your experiences and lessons learned over the years and opportunities for getting engaged. So folks in the US, um, look out for and look at the National Right to Food Community Practice website as an opportunity to join. I know there's a note, Allison, how would someone join the National Right to Food Community Practice?
If you go to our website, righttofood.org, righttofoodus.org, then there is a thing at the top that says, uh, what is it? It says how to get involved. We'll send it out to everyone.
Yes. Yes, and you've
There it
got
is.
colleagues putting
There
it
it
in
is.
for you. So thank
It's
you.
in the chat now.
So it's an opportunity for
Righttofoodus.org.
as for folks who want to do more engagement and
Yeah.
learning, especially in the US context, this is a strong opportunity. Um, Let's just put in a few different resources that's happening in Rhode Island, and folks in the Rhode Island and New England community reach out to Nessa and as their and collaborators there for thinking about what's next. And for other follow-ups, particularly the international context, where Laura and her team are available for getting people engaged and particularly anchored in their local context as well globally. Um, really excited for seeing this again as the start of many conversations, that this is a long-term process for getting things engaged at local levels, but really seeing this as potentially, and even for us in Illinois and Chicago, seeing this, how can we start grounding this, anchoring many of the policies we've already been advocating for years that would sit within this framework and could help be mutually reinforcing and provide some security, well, hopefully security over time, with always the ongoing engagement and activism that's required to hold people's feet to the fire for these things. But again, thank you all. Excited for what's next, and very appreciative also of our team from the CIFPAC side, Sarah Jane and Steph, who have been providing a ton of support today and getting everything lined up. Thanks to Letty for the translation support. We'll be sending this out before the end of the year as kind of a follow-up with the recording, the presentations, as well as the many resources that were talked about today and others. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.